Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next version of the Cybiant webinar series. Today, we have a topic which is very close to my heart, and which is how to design an RPA strategy and business case. So in the next half hour, 40 minutes, I will guide you through some of the steps which are considered best practice in order to get started with your RPA initiative. Before we get started with this webinar, a couple of things about our platform and the way that you can use it. First of all, you should note that this webinar is being recorded. So if you're missing any particular aspects in the presentation, we can always refer back to it. The recording will be shared with everybody who registered after the webinar has been completed. I always like to make these kinds of webinars very interactive. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question box that you can see in the Zoom platform. Due to the large number of participants that are in the webinar today, I won't be discussing the questions as we go along, but we will save them for a centralized Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions, already type them into the chat window so that we can start to deal with them accordingly. Last but not least, towards the end of this webinar, you will receive a short little survey from us. I really would like to encourage you to fill this all up because it will give us great input on which types of new topics we will need to cover in our upcoming series. Good, so that's a little bit of the housekeeping. Let's get started with the content itself. But before we get there, let me do a quick introduction about myself. My name is Jan-Willem Middelburg and I'm based in Kuala Lumpur for the company Cybiant, which is cyber information and technology. I've been in IT my whole life and most prevalently in the domains of big data and service automation. From the automation perspective, I've written the book, The Service Automation Framework, which has now been launched into a global certification scheme. So I've worked on numerous automation projects. So today I will be sharing a bit of my experience and especially on that very early phase. So how do you get started with automation and how do you build a business case in order to do that? And that's what I will be covering. After this session, if you would like to reach out to me, all my contact details are on the left. So if you reach out to me either through LinkedIn, Twitter, or through my email, you can find all my direct contact details there. Good. The topic of automation. It is something that especially in today's day and age, you cannot really go around anymore. Many organizations say that automation is the next disruption of work. And especially what we've seen in the last couple of months with this global pandemic is that organizations that had more automated processes in place were able to do better compared to organizations who didn't. And this wave of automation has been known for quite a while right now. Already in 2017, McKinsey did some predictions that coming over the horizon, there's this new wave that is coming and that provides a lot of opportunity for businesses. So it basically encapsulates techniques that have been developed in either robotics or machine learning and even the domain of AI. But what I personally really like about RPA technology is that it's so highly practical. So whereas a lot of organizations struggle with concepts like how do I implement machine learning or AI in a practical manner, you can really see that, robotic process automation is this very practical implementation of all of these different techniques. And I think that this is something that you should realize right from the onset is RPA is highly practical, but it also gives you this tremendous amount of opportunity. And what I've been really seeing in the last couple of years is that companies that started embarking on these automation projects tend to do better than some of their competitors. So what that means is that this is really a business opportunity. And if you do this automation techniques better than any of your competitors, you will get this competitive advantage in the next couple of years. So how does that impact businesses today? Well, a survey found that 93% of organizations that say that automation really kickstarts digital transformation. And we, of course, all know that digital transformation is this huge buzzword that every company is dealing with in their own manner. But as I mentioned before, RPA is so highly practical. And what I hope that you will get from the webinar today is that automation is not something that is highly complicated, because it sometimes sounds a bit scary, but in reality, everybody can use automation in their workforce. And it's, I think, not too far off that we can say that every computer will have an automated robot built in. Does that mean that it's going to replace the things that we do? No, definitely not. But you can use automation in order to ensure that repetitive tasks and that you need to do every single day can be managed and dealt with way more efficiently than ever before. So it's coming to the enterprise. It's a lot of organizations have already started with this. And what I will do today is further help you with how can you ensure that you can get started with automation, so that it can also really help you to kickstart your own digital transformation initiatives. I've get asked the question quite a lot, well, why should I do automation? What is the key benefits? Can we build a business case? And what I really am going to try to do today is provide you with some of the answers to these questions. And one of the slides that I really like is the one that you see in front of you. Automation is not just something that is a buzzword or the next IT hype. Automation is there to bring competitive advantage to businesses, because it can help you do things more quicker or more efficiently. And if you look at some of the major waves that we've seen in technology, especially since the early 2000s, we've seen that the organizations that adapt and adopt this technology very quickly tend to be the winners of tomorrow. So we had this huge first wave with the internet, and then came mobile, and then came cloud. And you see that all of the companies that went onto this bandwagon early are now considered the leaders in the industry. Where, as you see at the bottom of the slide, you see a number of companies that didn't make this transformation quickly enough, and they are now really struggling to keep up with that technology. And is that because they have better products or better services? The answer is definitely no, because they sell similar services, similar products. It's just their operating model that is completely different. And automation provides this way to enhance and increase your operating model. And that's why I think it's so highly useful for any kind of organization, whether you're providing HR services or financial services, whether you're selling insurance or you're just a very small company that has a particular technology solution. Automation can help because in every single organization, there are processes, and processes can be automated. And this is exactly what the topic of RPA aims to solve. So with robotic process automation, we really want to make sure that everything that is repetitive and needs to be done every single time can be automated efficiently. But of course, that's easier said than done. And in order to do that, you would need to start setting up a strategy. That's really one of the first key things that you would need to do. Good. Before I dive into the topic of explaining how you can start defining some of these aspects of a strategy, let's first go back to the very start of the definition, and that is the answer to the question, well, what is RPA exactly? RPA is a type of software, and it is most important to know that that software mimics the activity of human beings. And what that means is that just as you go into your office and you start up your computer and you start executing tasks, whether it is solving tickets on a help desk or producing sales quotations or sending out invoices, everybody who goes into an office and starts up a computer is doing a number of steps every single day. And what RPA is software that starts to look at what is the processes that people do during their workday, and can we find a pattern or a process which we can subsequently automate. So it's really the way that you should look at RPA is basically an additional helper. And that's basically also the reason why in all of the communication, you always see these robots, and you see a picture here on the screen. However, it's very important to memorize that RPA is not the robot itself. It has very little to do with actual robotica in terms of making the moving parts. RPA is software, and it can be installed on computers. So now that we know and have seen a little bit about the definition, these kinds of robots are most suitable to do repetitive stuff. And with repetitive stuff, we mean things that need to happen in an organization over and over again. And I think everybody who's been working for a while knows that in almost any organization today, we are still spending lots and lots of time copying information from one system to another, whether that's done through Excel sheets or through simple text files. A lot of work is still done is concerned with data entry or setting up a workflow or giving approval. And these things are repetitive. They happen every single day. And I sometimes refer to this as the kind of the swivel chair processes, because they need to happen in order to make sure that a business can operate. And it is these kinds of processes that are especially suitable for automation. So when we start building the business case, this is the first quick win. Look at the processes that are highly repetitive and see if you can find a way to automate them. So some very quick things that I always like to share before we get into the definition of defining a strategy. RPA is typically referred to as no-code commercial off-the-shelf technology. Why is this important? Well, it is important because you need to realize that you don't need to be a very advanced type of programmer in order to operate this. It is also not the case that you will need to start building your own scripts or that you need to have a very strong programming background. It's actually the opposite. If you have the ability to start thinking in terms of workflows, most commercial off-the-shelf solutions today offer these kinds of canvas where you can start building your own workflows in order to ensure that you can run your own robots. So it becomes very, very easy. The second key thing that you would like to know is that RPA provides enterprise-wide business benefits, meaning that it will just ensure that you can do work more effectively. One of the things I get asked a lot is, well, will it not take over jobs or will it not eliminate jobs? And I always say the answer is definitely no, because yes, the business case of RPA is built on ensuring that you can do things more efficiently. However, it is typically automating the tasks that people don't like to do anyway. So I've worked a lot on service desks in my life, and I've never met any service desk where people are getting very excited about, for instance, something as simple as a password reset. So RPA really provides the opportunity to automate mundane tasks that nobody would like to do anyway, so that it frees up more time for you in order to work on the things that do matter and that can improve the business overall. And that's also, if you look at the competitive advantage that RPA can bring, it's really all about how can we make sure that we spend more time on innovation, on bringing products to market, on all the things for which you need an actual brain. But the reality is that lots of companies really drown in a lot of repetitive stuff. And that means that they spend 80% of their time on doing things over and over again and just have a little bit amount of time for innovation. Whereas if you implement RPA processes, you can ensure that the majority of time you can spend on innovation and just 20% of your time you need to spend on doing mundane tasks. So that's really what RPA brings. The next and last major thing, and we will cover this in a little bit more detail later in the slides, is that RPA is not just technology. It is not just I bring in a couple of robots and it will start to work automatically. You need to set up a step-by-step plan. You need to think about the impact on the organization itself. You need to start thinking about upskilling or reskilling people to make sure that they can work with robots. And there's also a bit of culture change involved. So RPA is not just I download a piece of software and it starts working and my project is up and running. It is a little bit more complicated than that, as we will see in some of the upcoming slides. So before we get started in discussing, well, what are some of those benefits, I always really like this little cartoon that you see here on the screen. RPA has this dual reputation. On the one hand, people are very excited about the fact that they can start automating things and tasks that they don't want to do anyway. On the other hand, there's also always a bit of a scary element that they think that their job might be taken over by robots. And I'd like to address that like right away in the beginning of this presentation, because the whole purpose of RPA is not to eliminate jobs. It is to make sure that things can be done more efficiently, and that will generate competitive advantage for business. And the way that it works is that if you have a more competitive business, it means that you become more profitable and that you can grow, meaning that that doesn't lose jobs. It ensures that more jobs become available in the long term. The opposite is also true. If you don't automate and you don't use these new kinds of technology, you will be taken over by companies who do. And if that's the case, you will see that a lot of jobs will get lost because you failed to implement automation. So I'm always a very strong believer that automation is an opportunity and not so much as a threat. And I think that's something really important to address right at the beginning. Because if we then can finally make the bridge to kind of look at what are some of the key areas and key benefits of RPA. And we will incorporate this into the strategy part when we talk about that a little bit later. But before we get there, it's good to have a firm understanding as well. How can RPA drive my business? And in order to do that, I always like this classification into 4 major categories. RPA can help for internal operations, for enhancing your technology, for making sure that you have higher standards in terms of accountability and audits. And also, last but not least, it provides data analytics and reporting in a much more structured way. So let's see what we mean with that. And we'll start quickly with internal operations. In any large company, you always will have departments and operations that are primarily there to support business. Typical departments like that are finance, HR, IT services, procurement. And these kinds of business functions are all characterized by the fact that they're highly process oriented. So these are the key target areas for RPA. You also see that these are frequently considered cost centers in businesses, meaning that they need to be taken under firm cost control. So by implementing RPA solutions, this can really be a benefit of making sure that you can achieve that particular strategy. But it's not just the cost saving elements. If you move along your RPA journey, you will see that RPA can also be used to drive business. And that's really what we see when we talk about technology enhancement. So mundane tasks, which happen to be over and over again, frequently have to do because different systems don't talk to each other. And I think we've all been in situations where you have this piece of data, it might be an Excel sheet, and it needs to be transferred into another system. And that is because those 2 systems don't talk to each other. One might be in a cloud, another might be in premise. There's lots of different situations that you can think about. So technology enhancements can be achieved by system integration, because if robots are good at one thing, it is getting data from a system and then putting it into another system. That's probably the most easy workflow that there is. So in that way, it can really start to drive technology. The third major aspect has to do with the fact that robots don't make mistakes. A robot will always do exactly as it's programmed to do. Remember that RPA is just software. So if you drill that down into the basic statements, it's just a whole bunch of if-else statements. If this, then we do this. If something else, we do something else. If we click this button, we do something else. So that means that everything that goes through the system can be tracked and monitored. And that's especially important nowadays when we talk about accountability, audit, but also privacy and security regulations. So if you let a robot do some of these tasks, for instance, data migrations, you will always see that there is this audit trail. You can see exactly what has happened and why things happened. And that's also a benefit that is becoming more and more important over time. And then last but not least, major benefit of RPA is in the analytics form. So robots can run automated reports, they can help you with structuring your data, and they can query through large amounts of data in order to do that. So there's a very close relationship also between RPA and big data on the other hand. And that's not a bit of a topic that we will go through in this webinar, but just know that particular thing exists. So you might wonder, well, why am I sharing all of this? Why is it important to have a bit of an understanding of what are some of the key target areas of RPA and how can it help? And the way I always like to explain it is by this particular slide. Any organization that will exist in the world will have a number of different layers in terms of more strategic, tactical, and operational layer. And they are typically shaped in a pyramid shape because there are fewer people at the top and a lot of the work is done in the actual project itself. So we always see, and I'm just going to use the example of an IT operation here, is that there's this organizational strategy. And the organizational strategy basically defines the key business objectives and what do we want to achieve as a business. If we look at the IT strategy, the IT strategy exists to implement that organizational strategy. So it's one of the aspects that need to ensure that the overall strategic objectives are met. I realize that that's not always true in practice, but this is the way that it should be organized. So in the end, every IT strategy should be related to the overall organizational strategy. And then if we look at that IT strategy, it can be subdivided into different IT projects. For instance, a project to make sure that we can collaborate more easily, or a project to make sure that a new system gets introduced that will make it easier to work. So this is typically how improvement projects are shaped in any kind of organization. So organizational strategy provides the organizational objectives, growth plans, and corporate goals. But this is just part for the IT department. But something similar exists for different functional departments in any company. So if we look at the HR strategy, it should also be coupled to the organizational strategy. If we look at the financial strategy, it should also be coupled to the organizational strategy. So the point that I want to make here is that within the different departments that are part of any company, you see that the strategy of a particular division should always be related to the overall strategy of the company itself, and that it is subsequently subdivided into different projects. So what that has to do with RPA? Well, remember what we've just seen is that RPA provides business benefits on a number of these different areas. RPA can help with processing finance invoices. RPA can help with IT projects. RPA can help with making workflows for onboarding new employees, which would make it into the HR domain. So RPA is really a cross-domain, a cross-department, and a cross-functional solution. And this is frequently where I've seen it go wrong in some of the projects that we've been in. RPA frequently either starts as an HR project or it starts as an IT project, but you should take into account that RPA is cross-functional, because the whole concept of automation is not so much an IT kind of exercise or a finance exercise. It is process automation in the broadest sense of the word. So when you start defining what RPA can do within your own organization, try to think outside your own organizational limits. Try to think outside the current department that you're in, because RPA has a much broader application. And that's really why RPA can drive the overall business strategy, because automation in the end will need to be implemented in order to achieve a competitive advantage. And whether that's being achieved through finance or HR or IT, all of these should and must contribute to the overall goals of the organization. So it doesn't really matter in which department you are in. So this is the starting point. If you want to be successful with RPA, you really need to start thinking about what is my organizational strategy first, and how can different automation initiatives subsequently help to achieve that organizational strategy. And this is very, very frequently see it go wrong. So if you start to memorize and realize that, how can you then make it more practical? Because in the end, the conversation about organizational strategy, business objectives is all very well and nice, but you need to, and you want to make something which is more practical. So in this first lesson, and we'll get through another lessons a little bit later, is a number of different steps that you will go through. And as we've seen on the previous slide, you always need to start thinking first about what the business objectives are. In other words, what of this is the strategy of the organization? Now, I'll showcase a little example a little bit later, but let's first run through these steps in order to understand what the flow will be. So if we know what the business objective of the organization as a whole are, then as a next step, we want to make sure that we match those business objectives with the RPA benefits. So I've showcased to you the slide with the RPA benefits, and what you need to do is make a match between your overall business objectives and your RPA benefits. So what we've just seen, one of the business objectives might be to become more competitive or to have a better profit margin. Well, then we would need to look at operational expenditures. And we've seen that there are benefits defined within that silo. If the business benefit is to be more compliant, we go to the compliance column. So basically what we're doing here is that we're matching the RPA benefits that I discussed on the previous slide with the overall business objectives of an organization. And these, of course, will be different for any kind of organization. So if we know that and we've made this match, then we will see that there are a number of use cases. And use cases are things that we can actually do. A use case represents a real-world problem for which we can find a solution. In the previous slide that I showcased you with the pyramid, this would be an individual project. So a use case is something you can actually start working upon. And if you do it that way, the use case will be matched to your business objectives, and your business objectives will come from your overall strategy. So again, then it really doesn't matter which part of the silos or which kind of functional department that you are in. And then after you have your use case, then you can start building your business case. And remember that this presentation is called How to Build an RPA Strategy and a Business Case, because the financial aspect is very, very important as well. So you want to make sure that when you start doing your RPA implementations, that you have a positive net present value or return on investment, meaning that the money that you save or the benefits that you achieve, which could also be non-financial, are greater than the investment that you need to make. And this is also, for instance, why we see a lot of governments working with RPA at the moment, is because automation is not just a cost saver. It provides benefits to society because people can get their documentation quicker, they can get permits or approvals quicker, because it gets executed automatically. So I hope that by this slide you kind of start to understand that building your RPA strategy is in line with your organizational strategy, and that it follows a number of different steps. So in order to make this a little bit more practical, I have the same slide, but then with a number of, or an actual practical use case. So let's say that the organizational strategy and objective is to reduce customer churn. And let's say that this is going to be done, need to be done with 15%. In order to achieve that, we want to make sure that contracts are renewed quicker. So we want to have an expedited contract renewal. That means that that is the business objective, which is then coupled to an RPA benefit, because one of the key benefits of RPA is that we can expedite things quickly by doing them automatically. So if we've made this particular match, we can start to look at the automation of the contract renewal process. So in the organization itself, there will be some process for renewal of the contract. Otherwise, you wouldn't have customer churn. So we would need to review that particular process and find a way to automate the steps so that the new or revised contract is quicker with the customers. And if we do that, we can start to measure that by automating the contract renewal, we, for instance, speed up the contract renewal with 5 days, which will then subsequently result in 15 days less churn. So the business case towards the end can be calculated after you've identified and set up your contract renewal process. So I hope that this kind of slide illustrates a little bit further how the more theoretical aspects of these 4 steps can be translated into something which is more practical and tangible in the long run. Good, so that's the basic flow. The next key thing that you need to ask yourself is, what do we really know about automation? Because I've been involved in a lot of automation projects, and people who start out with RPA or other forms of like more machine learning or data projects, they always have very high ambitions, and they have a very strong vision of what they would like to achieve in terms of automation. However, if you then start asking some questions about, well, do we have any people in the organization that have coding capabilities or that can design workflows or that have any kind of experience with automating processes, then you see that there's very frequently this big gap between where the organization envisions to be and where they currently are. And I always refer to that as a capability gap, because it's not the fact that the organization cannot achieve that. It's just that they need to start building up capability in order to do that. So that's the second key lesson. As soon as you've identified these number of use cases that you think can improve the organization and that can contribute to the organizational objectives and business benefits, as we've just seen, then the next step is that you need to start assessing what your current capability is. And what do we mean with that? Well, in order to get your use case up and running, you will need to take a number of steps, and that is represented here by the ladder. These steps will bring you towards the use case and will start help you implement the use case. But you need to get there, and it's sometimes a bit of a journey to get there, because in order to do that, you will need to have knowledge about automation. You need to have people in your organization who will have technical or workflow design skills. You need to have the right type of technology. You need to have visibility on your current processes, which is not always the case. And then last but not least, and a very important element that I cannot stress enough, is that you need to think about your security and privacy impact. Because if you're going to let a robot do all the work and they are going to log in with credentials which belong to a human being, it becomes really difficult to kind of measure who was actually behind the computer. Was the workflow executed by the robot, or was it done by the person itself? So there's a lot of aspects involved in this case, and that is something that we would need to consider to move from current capability towards use cases. The good news is that this is not the first time that anybody has ever thought about this, and that there is an RPA maturity model in existence. And the RPA maturity model that you see on the slide in front of you consists of 4 levels. And as an organization starts with their RPA implementation journey, you typically progress through a number of stages. And within each of those stages, there are a number of capabilities that you can start to build up. So in lesson number 2, what we really want to do is first of all measure where we are today, and then make a combination of looking at what are the current capabilities that we would need in our current level, and also what are the capabilities that we would need to move towards our next level. So in a very summary slide, you see that there is these 4 levels that will help you move from a startup RPA program all the way towards a high-performing RPA program. And typically organizations progress with experience over time to move from level 1 towards level 4. And you see it with the arrow at the bottom of the slide, that as you move along in this process, you will get more and more enterprise value. So that's really in step number 2, the most important thing is to assess where you are. This is the way that the RPA capability model has been built. So I'll very briefly run through it. I won't go into all of the different aspects. If you're interested in that, I can share you the slides or provide you some more information about this after the call. But in order to assess capability, basically what you need to do is you kind of look at 10 core capability areas, 4 of which measure RPA technology capability, and 6 measure program management capability. And remember that early on in this presentation, I mentioned to you already that RPA is more than just buying some good technology. If you really want to be successful, you need to start thinking about your operating model, a program, management reporting, organizational impact, process improvement, and operations management, which are the 6 capabilities that you see at the bottom of the slide, which are program management capabilities. So as you move along in your RPA journey, which is based on your strategy, you start to look at each of those 10 capabilities and you grow them from level 1 to level 4 into a number of steps. And that is not done overnight. This is something that will take at least a couple of months in order to get there. And notice here that I've also, again, listed things like security, credentialing, and privacy, because they're all very relevant for ensuring that you set up robots in such a way that it's being auditable and trackable. So the key point I want to make here is that in order to measure all of these things, there are existing models in place that you can just start using to start measuring where your capability is at today. So how do you do that in more practical sense? Basically, you do assess your current capabilities by doing a survey. This can be done online, or you can do interviews. You measure all of the different levels of capability, and based upon that, you will get a result and you can identify the gaps. And if you know where you are today, then it becomes easy to kind of build up the capabilities towards the final use case. So that final use case is, what do you aim to achieve? And in order to get there, you will need to start building up the capabilities. 9 times out of 10 is, from my personal experience, it has a lot to do with knowledge. So you need to get people on board with knowing what RPA is, start to design processes, translating those processes into a particular solution, and that will really help to start getting towards that use case. So that will be showcased into the gaps. So that's the second step of building the strategy. Then we move towards the third one, and that is to start building these capabilities through the use cases. So basically, you can see every use case as a new learning project. So that goes into a circular kind of fashion, because the knowledge that you achieve during one of your previous use cases can be used to implement the new one. So it's a very simple cycle. You start with identifying your use case, then you start building your first robots. You identify which processes they impact. Then you build capability into that particular process. And then you embed the lessons that you've learned. And with those lessons that you've learned in the previous use case, you start identifying and automating your next one. So moving up the chain, or moving throughout, increasing your organizational capabilities and your maturity levels, is basically a cycle of running through this cycle over and over again. Because every time that you do it, you will learn new things, which will automatically increase your capability. So those use cases are coming from all of the different aspects that we've seen before. And these use cases can be very practical. So for instance, within finance, you can think about process to pay kind of processes, or record to report. In supply chain management, you can use these use cases for inventory management, invoicing, contract management, planning. In IT, it's about helping users, setting up your servers, app monitoring, etc., etc. So all of these capabilities can be built through the use cases. And it's generally considered best practice to start with the processes that are very easy to identify, and then help to build them up first. And then start, when you have those capabilities, start moving towards more complex types of processes. Good. And then last, lesson 4. What you need to do in order to make sure that you keep using and keep evaluating the benefits of RPA is keep updating the business case. And remember that this is the last step out of the 4 steps that we've seen before. Making the initial business case is always very simple, because you can always look at an existing process in an organization. You see how many hours are being spent on that process by how many people, and then you start implementing an RPA solution, and you can see that even though you need to put in more money for the particular solution, that the amount of hours that you spend are reduced, and the amount of people that need to work on that particular process is also reduced. So I always say the initial business case, making the first financial ROI, is the simplest, because that's just either 1 or 2 robots. It's one process. You can exactly calculate how much time you save. You can put a particular value towards that in terms of money. However, the reason that I'm saying keep refining the business case is that with your RPA journey and throughout the 4 different levels, refining your business case becomes more complex. Because as soon as you start to implement more robots over time, you need to start about additional aspects. And these RPA aspects are not always included into the straightforward business case analysis that we've just seen. Here you can think about, if you have a more comprehensive RPA program, you also need to start thinking about advanced security and privacy processes. As I've mentioned before, you need to have good aspects, especially in terms of credentialing. Is it you that is working with the computer, or is it actually the robot? And that means that you will need to have advanced monitoring and reporting systems and processes. You also need to know what you will need to do in terms of any kind of disaster, because remember, RPA is just software. So if something goes wrong, you need to be able to be up and running again quickly. And last, and I would say most importantly, is you need to start thinking about processes for knowledge retention, because people have a better way of absorbing knowledge. And with knowledge, I'm really talk about making sure that you can make decisions based on past experience, whereas robots typically just execute. So they are great tools to execute very many things very quickly, but knowledge retention is way more difficult to embed in a robot itself. So as your automation project becomes more complex, these are additional factors that you need to factor in. And they also have a cost associated with them. And this is where you see it going wrong in many cases. As soon as an RPA program is up and running, these particular aspects need to be included in the overall business case. So as you go through your RPA implementation journey and you start executing your strategy, you always need to keep refining your business case, both on a financial aspect as well as a non-financial one. So you always need to ensure that the amount of effort that you put in the end is worth it from a financial point of view. Good. So I've been talking already quite a lot again, and as you know, I can talk about this topic for hours, but I think it's about time that we start rounding things up and go towards some of the questions. So what we've covered in the last 30, 40 minutes, is what are the key steps and the key lessons that you would need to identify in order to set up your RPA strategy and to set up your business case. And we briefly talked about these 4 major areas that I highly recommend that you take over when you're considering RPA. Start first with defining a strategy, but always couple it to an organizational strategy. So RPA, it's not a finance thing, it's not an IT thing, it's not an HR kind of tool. It needs to be embedded as part of the organizational strategy. Second thing that we talked about is the RPA capabilities and that you need to assess them. And we've covered extensively what the RPA Capability Maturity Model looks like and the 4 different levels. And then we started looking at how do we build capability through use cases, and that basically building capability is a cycle of doing more use cases in order to build up your capabilities over time. And then last but not least, we talked about the need to keep refining your business case, and that a business case becomes more complex the larger your RPA implementation is becoming. So these are some of the 4 lessons. Then there's a little bit more practical aspects, which is kind of the best practice that we've collected over the years with RPA. Just some very quick things to share that can help you become successful is don't wait too long. As we've seen, you can get started on a very small scale. So in order to be successful with RPA, just get started. Start designing your first robot. Start with doing some initial planning. Always ensure that there's good collaboration between the RPA program and the CIO, because in the end, remember, RPA is software, so it will always have an IT component. Even if you're in an HR department or in a finance department, RPA will always have a finance or an IT component. Third, establish aggressive goals and deliver. So that is what we mean with building up the capabilities and doing these typical use cases. Then invest in the process assessment and improvement capabilities. This is exactly what we've seen when we talked about the RPA Maturity Model. And then last but not least, balance the dual priorities of governance and productivity. So this is also the key point I wanted to make when we talked about business cases. Yes, RPA will increase productivity, but also take into account that you will need to have more governance processes, especially in security and credentialing, as you move throughout your RPA journey. So these are some of the lessons that I wanted to share to you today. Obviously, if you want to know more about RPA and what it can do for your organization, we at Cybiant, we embed and adopt RPA solutions across Southeast Asia using best practices, lessons learned, and proven strategies. So if you want to do something like that, please feel free to reach out to me after this call. While we were doing this webinar, I saw a lot of questions come in, so I'm gonna open up those questions, and then we will go through the different ones. The first question is, what is the difference between RPA and artificial intelligence? Well, that's a very interesting question, also a very good one to answer. With RPA, we're trying to mimic what a human being does, where that is obviously also one of the key points that we want to do with artificial intelligence. However, artificial intelligence goes one step further and wants to mimic autonomous thinking. So with AI solutions, we really want to make sure that the robot executes and thinks the way that a human should. We could say that RPA uses elements of AI, but RPA is in nowhere near at the level of artificial intelligence in terms of autonomous decision-making. So most RPA solutions implement a particular aspect, and they ensure that a number of processes are done automatically, but they don't think for themselves. Next question is from Chi Lin. Can I have a copy of the slides presented? The answer is absolutely. After this webinar, we will share the recordings and the presentation slides with everyone. Next question is there a specific tool or software you would recommend? The answer to that is there are a number of great software products out there The one that we are working with at Cybiant is called UiPath, which is one of the leaders in the domain. So that is where we have implementation history with. So that's the tool that we would embed when we do RPA projects. Fourth question, what are factors you must look for in RPA software? Well, the answer to that is very interesting and also I think very clear. The software that you select needs to be able to fit your particular business needs. And what we mean with that is it needs to have integrations towards the data that is used in your organization. So most software products will be able to connect with standard databases and standard software tools, but it's very important always to look at the integrations between the data that you currently have and what the RPA tool can do. And then the last question is, how long does a robot automation project takes on average? Well, that really depends on the complexity of the process. For first, we typically refer to this as pilot projects. We see that that will take 2 to 4 weeks. If it's a more extensive program in which multiple processes need to be automated, it typically takes 2 to 4 months to do it. So that's on average in terms of what it will take. Again, the last point I want to stress about that, the whole journey is highly dependent on what are the capabilities that you need to build up in your organization itself. Let's have a look. I think this is the last question. Yes, it is. Okay, so having answered the last question, I think it's time, because we're also almost out of time, to start closing off on this particular session. I would like to thank everyone for participating in the webinar today. Once again, the recording and the slides will be shared with you after the session itself. If you have any questions or would like to follow up, you can find our contact details online or on the slides that I've just sent. Thanks again for participating in the webinar today, and I hope you found it useful, and I hope to see you again on any of our upcoming webinar series. Thanks, and until next time.